share my screen first. Now, where's that? Okay. Okay, so my topic, I hope you can see my screen, Indigenous Peoples of Southeast Asia, Issues and Challenges. Okay, I have two objectives in this sharing. I would like to call it sharing so that you are familiarized with the situation in Southeast Asia. First is to identify who indigenous peoples are in general, but Dr. Kamrul has already done that. But in particular, in Southeast Asia, who are the indigenous peoples? Secondly, to identify key issues and challenges affecting indigenous peoples in the Southeast Asian region. So for those who are not familiar with Southeast Asia, so this is east of South Asia. So it is basically divided into mainland Southeast Asia and insular Southeast Asia. So mainland Asia, Southeast Asia consists of the countries such as Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Malay Peninsula, which is part of Malaysia. And insular Southeast Asia includes the Philippines, Indonesia, the eastern part of Malaysia, and East Timor. Of course, this is practically the map of the ASEAN region, the countries comprising the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. If I will use a cultural definition of Southeast Asia, I may even go wider than this to include Taiwan, because the indigenous peoples of Taiwan are very much related to the indigenous peoples of the Philippines and other parts of the region. But I won't be discussing about Taiwan in this lecture. So Southeast Asia is a very ethnically diverse region, as you can see in these pictures. They wear different attires. They wear physically, some of them are darker and shorter than others. They would have different cultures and traditions, and there are many factors for this variability ethnically. Of course, even modern day Southeast Asia is very diverse. There are big and huge countries such as Indonesia, which has 3 time zones, and very small ones such as Brunei and East Timor, which is not listed in that list. Some are richer than others. And of course, if we go to pre-modern Southeast Asia, of course, these national boundaries won't be there. It is largely a product of the colonial history of Southeast Asia. Some countries have been colonized by the French, such as Indochina, consisting of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Some countries have been occupied by the British, such as Malaysia and Singapore, which was then part of the Malay Peninsula. Some countries have been colonized by Spain and America, such as the Philippines. And some have not been formally colonized, such as Thailand, which kept its distinct traditional characteristic because it was kept as a buffer country between the French Indochina and the British Myanmar. Okay, I failed to mention Burma, now called Myanmar. So if we are going to talk about indigenous peoples as representing a carryover of pro-modern Southeast Asia, the boundaries will not be the same. There are indigenous peoples who are part of different countries within this region, as I shall point to you later. Okay, so here you can see the majority populations of Southeast Asia, like Brunei, uh, the majority of which are racially called Malay, consisting of 64%, followed by the Chinese, who are non-indigenous to Brunei. So where are the remaining percent? And basically, that will be the indigenous people of Brunei. Okay, I won't be discussing each one of this because we will be going into so many details. But as was mentioned a while ago by Dr. Kamrul, so in the past, the one categorization used was uh, ethnic minorities. So indigenous peoples are the ethnic minorities of these countries. But that term isn't too precise because some of these ethnic minorities, such as the Chinese, the Indians, the Tamil, are not indigenous to this region, but were only brought in or migrated into this region. So we're talking about the original peoples of this area. The Philippines is quite unique because there is not one ethnic group that is dominant in the country. So the biggest will be the Tagalog. That's where I came from. This is the ethnic group that is within the National Capital Region. This is Metro Manila. But if you add Tagalog, Cebuano, all the way to Pangasinan, they make up the bigger majority of the population, and they would have certain characteristics that are shared, and the remaining indigenous peoples will have differences from this majority population, mainly because they have kept their traditional indigenous practices despite colonialization. So I know the definition of indigenous peoples has already been given, at least from UN or international agencies. So as an anthropologist, and many of us here are anthropology professors and students, so this definition comes from Conrad Kotak, uh, using his textbook in general anthropology. So he defined indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of particular territories. So it may be equivalent to the Aborigines, as in the case of Australia. Uh, he further continued that indigenous peoples are often descendants of tribes people who live on as culturally distinct colonized peoples, many of whom aspire autonomy. So because we already have nation states in the world, in Southeast Asia, the nation states are more or less defined. Of course, there would be areas of contention, but within these nation states, there will be original inhabitants that have remained distinct culturally from the rest due to colonization, and they aspire self-determination in the form of autonomy. So this comes from Kotak. But of course, that is an academic definition, and we will have some sort of legal definitions or broadly accepted by uh, legal entities. So this has already been mentioned. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues used several criteria primarily self-identification. If people feel that they are distinct from the rest and they are recognized by neighboring groups as distinct from them, then they are an indigenous community. They have historical continuity with pre-colonial or pre-settler societies. They have a strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources. They have distinct social, economic, and political systems. That's an or. So one may be present, the other may be absent. They have distinct language, culture, and beliefs. They form non-dominant groups of society. So this is very important, especially when applied to Southeast Asia. So we are not referring to those who are in the majority or who have the political and economic power in these countries. Because many Southeast Asian nations will say, but we are all indigenous. We are not migrants to these areas. We have been here prior to colonization by Western powers. But of course, when we talk about indigenous peoples, we talk about non-dominant groups. And they resolve to maintain and reproduce ancestral environments and systems which, according to studies of anthropologists, are more sustainable practices because they recognize uh, uh, an ecosystems approach in the relationship between flora, fauna, and humans. Now, one other agency is the World Bank and other multilateral agencies. The Asian Development Bank will have another definition. The International Finance Corporation, although allied with the World Bank, will have somewhat a different definition. So I won't go into the differences among these definitions, but I'm citing the World Bank definition because it has been applied when uh, countries go into environmental and social impact assessments, when they establish development projects and request or apply for funds from the World Bank because they are World Bank member countries, and World Bank will insist you should apply the requirement for free and prior informed consent, which has been discussed a while ago. So, in what context is this applicable? So, according to the World Bank, indigenous peoples refer to distinct, vulnerable social and cultural groups possessing the following characteristics in varying degrees. So some of these in bullets may be very apparent, but some may not be as prominent now than it was in the past. So they have self-identification and identification by others. So it's not a one-way identification. You cannot say, I belong to an IP community or in an indigenous community, but no one agrees that you believe that you belong to that community. So it should be mutual recognition. Second, collective attachment to land and natural resources. Third, they have customary cultural, economic, social, or political institutions that are separate from those of dominant society, and culture. So in Southeast Asia, there would be a variation of these various customary cultural, economic, social, and political institutions. So some will be in the form of sultanates, basically Islamic sultanates. Some will be in the form of chiefdoms. Some will be hunting and gathering societies. So these differences should also be looked at and taken into consideration. And of course, another very important consideration is the possession of an indigenous language, because We believe, as anthropologists, that language is the soul of a culture. Therefore, it carries with it the belief systems, the traditions, the values, etc. of that population. Now, because I come from the Philippines, I will give many examples coming from the Philippines, but also because within Southeast Asia, it is probably the Philippines only that has a legally defined uh, definition of who indigenous peoples are. The Philippines has ratified uh, Republic Act number 8371, otherwise known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. So basically, it is more or less similar to what has been already discussed. So I won't, so self-ascription and ascription by others, comparing that to self-identification, identification by others. They have claims of ownership since time immemorial, occupied, possessed, and utilized ancestral territories. So they have traditional territories. So they may not have papers to prove that they own these territories, but since they could recall, this is the legal definition in the Philippines of since time memorial, as far as they could recall, their ancestors have stayed in these territories. Sharing common bonds of language, that is very much easy to understand. And I think this is a very important criterion. Through resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-indigenous religions and cultures, they became historically differentiated from the majority of Filipinos. So our law recognizes, yes, majority of Filipinos in the Philippines are indeed indigenous to the Philippines. They are originally from the Philippines. But because of colonization, the majority, such as the Tagalogs, have been colonized and therefore adopted Christianity, adopted Western culture and traditions, while the rest have maintained their indigenous practices. So this is an important criterion when applied to the Philippines. Elsewhere in the region, it is not as clear, and there have been many terminologies that are being used with varying applications of these terminologies. So the terms that are being used elsewhere in the region, in Indonesia, they refer to adat communities. Adat refers to customary law. It is not based on Sharia law, but these are the laws of the communities even before the coming of Islam into Indonesia. So which communities still practice these customary laws? So this is the criterion used in Indonesia. Let me mention that Indonesia doesn't want to use the term indigenous people or indigenous peoples because they would argue we are all indigenous here in Indonesia. So they prefer to use this term. So in Cambodia, the term is Chuntiat, which is referring to ethnic communities. A very common term that has been used and still used by some is ethnic minorities. But as I mentioned, we have to differentiate those that are not indigenous to the area, but migrated into the region, but because their population is smaller, therefore they are minorities. So they are not indigenous people to the area. In mainland Southeast Asia, most particularly in Vietnam and in Thailand, they mention the term hill tribes. Of course, in Vietnam, during the time of French occupation, they are referred to as the montagnards. So they are the mountain peoples, as opposed to the majority that are agricultural communities found in lowland areas of this region. In the Malay Peninsula, they use the term Orang Asli, which literally means original people. So they are not Malay because, of course, if we trace the origin of the Malays, they came not from Malaysia, but from Sumatra in Indonesia. So the Orang Asli are the original people of the Malay Peninsula. Now, what is problematic in Malaysia? So they have this category for the Malay Peninsula, but when they apply it to eastern part of Malaysia, particularly Sabah and Sarawak states, they don't use the term Orang Asli because there would be various ethnic groups in the region. In Thailand, one term used for hunters and gatherers is Sakai, which originally meant slave and was a derogatory term not acceptable to indigenous people. So because Southeast Asia is a very diverse region, mainly because of its geographic character. So there are mountains, there are islands, like Indonesia and the Philippines are both archipelagos. So within different islands, there would be different ethnic groups as well as linguistic groups that have emerged and are original to these areas. So there would be hundreds of indigenous groups or even thousands within Southeast Asia. So I could not discuss all of them. Let me highlight some more than others. As I mentioned, this is a sharing, so I would like to uh, just give examples. Okay, let me first go to common indigenous. So in the Philippines, you will see that Negrito populations are spread out in the archipelago. They look similar phenotypically, but interestingly, when we talk about their language, they will have different languages. Their languages are not intelligible with one another. Actually, their languages today are very much similar to the languages of their neighboring groups, who are non-Negrito. So many anthropologists believe that actually the earliest form of adaptive mechanism that they acquired in order to survive is to borrow the languages of neighboring groups. So they have lost their original non-Austronesian languages. Interestingly, one of these groups, which is the Agta, located in northeastern Luzon, is still a hunting-gathering society, unlike the others that are now sedentary. So this is of interest to anthropologists because we know that in the prehistoric past, humans of the world were primarily hunters and gatherers. And ethnoarchaeologists in particular are very much interested in studying hunting and gathering societies that still exist in the world today so that we understand how it was in the prehistoric past. Another group of indigenous people that are spread in Southeast Asia, mainly in insular Southeast Asia, are the Bajao people found in the borders of Indonesia Malaysia, and the Philippines. The Bajau are seafaring peoples. So some of them live in houseboats. Others live in houses raised on stilts, such as the one you see at the back. But these stilts are established on top of coral reefs. So they move about from place to place. Interestingly, based on their folklore, they believe that they originated from Malacca in Malaysia. Now, they lived in boats. One night, according to their folklore or their folk stories, they rested. They tied their boats on a piece of rock protruding out of the sea. But when they woke up in the morning, they were in another place because it wasn't a rock, but a giant sea turtle. So that is their story of how they moved about. So the Bajau, they are called by other names in the region. They are also called Sama in southern Philippines. They are also called Sama Dilaut, meaning Sama of the seas, as opposed to the Sama that live on land. The Bajau may have different spellings, but they share a common language and they move about these territories even without passports and visas. So they are marginalized in these three countries. Although they would say that they are Muslims, even among Muslim ethnic groups, they are very much discriminated because they are branded as being pagans, because they still practice, together with Islam, certain animistic practices. So you could just imagine some of the issues confronted by both the Negritos that are nomadic and the Bajau, also nomadic, one nomadic on land, this one nomadic on sea. So many of them, we don't have an actual count or census because they move about. Secondly, in terms of establishing government services such as schools, so you establish a school in certain Bajau territories. The children go to school, but later on they don't finish school because they have moved elsewhere. As I mentioned, in Indochina as well as in Thailand, a common term will be, as well as in Myanmar, a common term that is used is hill tribes because they live in the hills. And many of them are tourist destinations within this region. The picture on the left is in Sapa in northern Thailand. So it's a tourist destination for trekkers, backpackers, mountain climbers. The other one on the right is the Palong of Chiang Mai, Thailand. Although in Thailand, they would claim that they are not indigenous to Thailand, but they are originally from Myanmar who have moved into Thailand. So again, uh, so there are issues pertaining to uh, tourism and how tourism has affected their cultures. There is the issue of migration, such as, are they original Thai citizens? If not, therefore don't have benefits of being Thai. So these are some of the issues confronted by these peoples. Of course, in the historical past, such as during the Vietnam War, uh, the United States has capitalized on these differences of hill tribes by arming them and fighting Vietnamese liberation forces. So the issue of divide and rule has been an issue for many of these hill tribes. Clamor for self-determination. Some groups not just fighting for autonomy, but going into armed confrontation with the government of Indonesia in order to establish an independent Papuan state. So again, that would be an issue that is common in the region. Now, of course, okay, in the Philippines, although the law, which is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, does not recognize, ironically, the Bangsamoro of southern Philippines. They are Muslim groups in southern Philippines, consisting of these different ethnic groups. They will have different languages. What is common is that all of them have been Islamized when Islam came to the Philippines during the 15th century. Uh, Now, why have I included this slide? Because in the Philippines, although I said that we have a law that recognizes indigenous peoples, that law does not recognize the Bangsamoro as indigenous people because according to lawmakers, Islam is not indigenous to the Philippines. It has just been introduced to the Philippines. But when we talk about pre-colonial Philippines, practically the entire Philippines, from the southern province of Tawi-Tawi all the way to northern Luzon, particularly the province of Pangasinan, have been Islamized prior to the coming of the Spanish. Even Manila was a Islamic city prior to the coming of the Spanish. So why are they excluded? And because of that exclusion, they are do not benefit from the rights accorded by that law. Okay, so just some data on the Bangsamoro Philippines. They have been Islamized. The earliest sultanate in the Philippines was established in 1450 in Sulu. And you will still see in southern China descendants of the Sulu chieftain that visited China uh, prior to the advent of Western colonization, and many Muslim groups in southern China are very much related to Muslims in southern Philippines. There was a very strong secessionist movement in the past calling for the establishment of a separate Bangsamoro Republic. Bangsa, by the way, means nation. At present, there is a Bangsamoro autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, but this is an autonomous setup within the Philippine state and not a totally independent nation. Now, let me go to, as I mentioned, I won't go into very distinct and particular indigenous group within the region. I know in our participants here, I also saw Dr. Montri of Thailand. So maybe later during the open forum, he could share to us more about the situation in Thailand. But here are some common issues. The non-recognition as indigenous peoples by the state, and therefore there is no recognition of their rights as indigenous peoples. So, unlike the Philippines, the rest of Southeast Asia has no law regarding indigenous people's rights. Although some other countries have adopted the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but when they apply it to their countries, they would say, oh, but that is a different case. This is indigenous, this is not. Okay. Another issue will be commercialization of their culture, especially because of tourism. So, of course, Southeast Asia is generally a tourist destination, especially for Westerners who want to see the exotic, who want to see the Oriental. And therefore, many of Southeast Asian states have capitalized on this by uh, quote unquote preserving the culture of indigenous peoples. But some issues remain. Like, for example, I've heard among indigenous people of the Philippines saying, why do you want us to remain traditional when you have changed? So why are you prohibiting us? So that violates the right to self-determination. It is actually the indigenous people who have the right to say what they want to maintain and what they want to change. Of course, a lot has changed in their cultures because of the coming in of the money system. Uh, Many of their traditional products are mainly produced for the tourist market, even if traditionally they were produced for ritual purposes. So, for example, certain death blankets are for sale for tourists because they look nice, but actually they should only be worn by the dead in a death ritual. Or certain dances are performed for the delight of tourists, even if originally they were only for ritual purposes. The third issue is conversion into non-indigenous religions. So many of the indigenous peoples have been converted into Christianity or Islam, depending on what is the dominant religion in that particular area of Southeast Asia. Some of these conversions were by force. Others, they were co-opted because people saw that there would be some benefits in being converted. For example, in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in the Philippines, so the Bangsamoro are the dominant group there. They are Muslims. But within that territory, there are indigenous people who are animists. But those groups, such as the Teduray, they recognize, but if we don't become Muslim, probably we will be marginalized in this region. So it would be better to be converted. So these are some of the issues. Loss of indigenous languages, some of them by outright imposition. I remember even when I was a child, although Tagalog is a majority group in the Philippines, when I was a child in the 1960s and 1970s, in the school, we were disallowed into using our native language. We were forced into using English. And for every word that is spoken that is Tagalog, you are fined for it. You have to pay something to the school. So this is a form of colonial imposition that has been continued by the so-called independent states of Southeast Asia. Some of the loss of indigenous languages is because of contact with dominant groups, and indigenous people have adopted the languages of neighboring groups. Then the displacement from their traditional territories in order to pave way for development. So because indigenous peoples inhabit resource-rich areas, such as mountainous areas, maritime communities, forests, where the resources are, such as gold, copper, and other minerals, logging and lumber products, timber, fish, and other aquatic resources. So, because the national state sees there is a priority to develop these resource rich areas so that everyone in the nation state will benefit from it, the indigenous peoples are asked to sacrifice in the name of the broader majority. Okay. Of course, that was before the concept of free and prior informed consent was being uh, applied by some states and some funding agencies. But even that system can be bastardized or co-opted. Later, I can discuss it during the open forum. So in the Philippines, for example, you will see here a map of the Philippines. We are an archipelago of 7,500 islands. And to the left and the right of the map, listed there are various groups of indigenous peoples whose languages are endangered, whether threatened, shifting, moribund, nearly extinct, dormant, or actually extinct. These are linguistic categories. Again, I won't go into that, but all of them are endangered languages. Okay, to continue with common issues and problems, this is the last slide for common issues and problems. Cases of ethnic cleansing and genocide, such as the most famous one, of course, an issue will be the Rohingya of Myanmar. Although people from Myanmar will say, but they are not indigenous to Myanmar. They came from Bangladesh and only migrated into Myanmar. So this is a bone of contention, but definitely there are violations of human rights of the Rohingya people, mainly coming from the armed forces of Myanmar. Of course, the dominant population of Myanmar is Buddhist, while the Rohingya are Muslims. So a while ago, when I presented the dominant ethnic groups in Southeast Asia, because they are the dominant, they will always impose their culture on the rest of society. For example, majority of Filipinos, about 83%, are Roman Catholics. Therefore, it is always said, but of course, this is a myth, that the Philippines is a Catholic country, it's a Christian country. But what does it mean if you say that? Does it mean that if you are non-Catholic, therefore you are not a Filipino? So in Thailand, they will say to be Thai is to be a Buddhist. So if you belong to an indigenous community in Thailand that is not Buddhist, does it mean you're not Thai? Or in Malaysia and in Brunei, they say to be a Malaysian, you have to be Malay and you have to be Muslim. So what about the Orang Asli who are not Malay, don't speak Malay, and are not Muslim? So these are some of the problems. Militarization of their ancestral territories due primarily to conflict between the state military forces and armed rebel groups. So within various parts of Southeast Asia, either existing today or sometime in the past, there have been secessionist movements coming from indigenous peoples that want to establish their own states. So, for example, in Papua of Indonesia, there is the OPM, the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, or the Free Papua Movement, that have taken arms against the government. In southern Philippines, there are Moro rebels wanting to establish an independent Bangsamoro state. They have taken arms. In the past, in southern Thailand, there was a Patani United Liberation Organization wanting to separate Patani region from Thailand and establish a Muslim state in the region. But now it's not as strong anymore in that region. So in these areas, because of the presence of such armed movements, militarization, mainly coming from the nation state, has happened, and the indigenous people have been caught in the crossfire. So they either have to play along with the state or play along with the armed rebel groups in order to survive. Now, when these two groups come face to face, they are caught in the middle and become victims of armed conflicts. Then lastly is the right to self-determination is not recognized, at least as described by Dr. Kumar in terms of the external definition. You cannot secede from our nation states. You only have the option to be an autonomous region within our nation state. So these are some of the common problems and issues happening in the region right now. So I've discussed Rohingya. This is my last slide. So what are the challenges? What can be done? One challenge is how to build a peaceful, multi-ethnic Southeast Asia or multi-ethnic communities in Southeast Asia. Ethnic diversity is a given in Southeast Asia. But how can people live peacefully in the region, respecting one another in the region? The second, so I envy the Arctic region. They have this uh, network of indigenous peoples. In Southeast Asia, there is no regional bloc of indigenous peoples movements. Yes, they will have links with one another. That's good. They share information with one another, but there's no ASEAN network of indigenous peoples movements. Even in my home country of the Philippines, indigenous peoples are divided from one another because they belong to different organizations. And sometimes there is infighting even among these different organizations. Some of the reasons are because of influences of external groups, but some of the differences also are because of geographic spread. Now, I would like to see that in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, there is a formal recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples within the region. This is still something that has to be worked on by advocates of indigenous peoples' rights in Southeast Asia. And I hope anthropologists in the region uh, uh, take hand in hand together in advocating these rights. Here are my concluding remarks. Reflecting as an anthropologist or as an academic, there is an urgent need to study and document the indigenous cultures of Southeast Asia before they change drastically due to acculturation and modernization processes. Of course, that is already taking place, but it will definitely intensify. So let us do research as anthropologists. It is important to make the public aware about the richness of indigenous culture and to value cultural diversity. So it is our tasks as anthropologists to share to the public about the notions and concepts of cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competence. Anthropologists act as culture brokers between the wider public and indigenous peoples or other marginalized stakeholder groups. We are able to cross the boundaries of these two groups, and therefore we are in a position to share to the other about uh, how to understand the other. Lastly, because I am in ICOM, in the International Council of Museums, while heritage preservation is indeed important, it is the right of indigenous peoples to determine which aspects of their culture they would want to preserve and which ones they would want to change. We do not impose on them what to preserve and what to change. If we believe in the right to self-determination, it is really up to them, of course, based on informed consent. We share to them the options, but they ultimately decide. So this is all. Thank you very much. I know there's an open forum, but if you want to send me an email, my email is mtcastro1@up.edu.ph.